Okay, I think we'll kick off. So, welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm joined today by some of my colleagues. My name is Mark Boucher-Gibbs. I'm a consultant at SAC Consulting, and I've been working with Iain, who's been leading on this project. Um, uh, what I'll do is I'll hand over to Iain shortly. One note to mention is we'll have the presentations, and then if you'd like to post questions, could you do it in Q&A on the bottom tab, and once we're through the presentations, I'll relay the questions to the panel, and we'll pick up some conversation on the back of your inquiries. So it's my pleasure to introduce Iain Riddell. Iain Riddell's a long-standing consultant with SAC Consulting, semi-retired now, but as I say, led on this project. Over to you, Iain, if you would please. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Mark, and welcome everybody to our webinar, our SAC Consulting webinar on unlocking the potential of sugar beet in Scotland. Why are we looking at this just now? Well, we think there is a potential for sugar beet, and it's mainly through the industrial biotechnology end of things to provide a bio-based feedstock for some industrial products. So it's not sugar, it's more industrial products that we're looking at. So the format today, we realize we've got quite a mix of people attending. We've got farmers, we've got agricultural industries, we'll have people from the chemical side, and we'll have people who are quite curious. So I thought it'd be good to run through a few things just at the start to give you an introduction on the history of sugar beet in Scotland, on the work we've done in the project so far, and then we'll move on to John Hand of Scottish Enterprise, who's going to talk about things from the chemical side and describe some of the amazing potential there are for bio-based feedstocks. I attended the IBioIC conference this week, and there are some amazing things being done in the drive to replace fossil fuels as the feedstock for these products. So John will describe that and how sugar might fit in. And then we'll move on to talking about the field trials in 4 farms, which will also give us a chance to talk about how sugar beet is grown for those who haven't heard about that story before. And Gordon Cairns is going to join me to describe that. Gordon's grown sugar beet for quite a number of years. So before I move on to the next slide, I would just like to thank our funders, who are IBioIC, which is the Industrial Biotechnology Innovation Centre, and Scottish Enterprise, who provided the funds for this project and also all the work that's been done in sugar beet for the last 6 or so years. I'd also like to thank KWS for donating seed sugar beet for growing on the farms. I'd like to thank Scottish Agronomy, who helped out in one of the trial assessment sites in Fife doing the assessments. And I'd mainly like to thank our cooperating farmers who provided the land and allowed us to grow the strip trials on their farms, who are Andrew Booth, Ian Wilson, and Gordon Cairns at Stracathro, Ross Foster at Peace Hill, and Sean Williams at the Clew Estates in the Borders. So I will move on to the first slide, which is on the history of sugar beet in Scotland. And I've titled it When Sugar Beet Was Big in Scotland. Now, if we travelled back in time to the late 1960s or early 70s, you'd find that a lot of farmers were outraged by the fact that the British sugar plant was about to close. And at that time, the sugar factory had a capacity for 16,000 acres, which would be around about 5,000 to 6,000 hectares of crop. And this was gathered from all over Scotland, from Morayshire and even the Black Isle, I think, in the north, right down to Berwickshire. And the reason for this wide distribution was it was ideally situated on the main East Coast railway line. And the railway line, a siding, ran right through the factory. And they also had water from the River Eden. So that was why it was sited there. And the industry was set up back then for a reason that we're all familiar with: food security. It was just after the First World War, and they wanted to be sure of a supply of sugar that couldn't be interrupted by having to come across huge oceans. So that was the reason they wanted to grow it. The main growing areas were Fife and Angus, but as I say, it was pretty widespread in Scotland. And it was terrible timing, really, to close down the factory. It may not have been viable, that may have all been true, but at that point, there were some great advances in agriculture, and monogerm seed that just produced one shoot from each seed had just been introduced, which removed all the difficulty that the farmers had in singling the crops before. Also, they had new machinery, they had herbicides, they had fertilizers, so it could have taken off, but it was taken away from Scotland at that point in 1972. And if you're interested, you can look up the internet and see quite a few articles on it. And there's quotations from Hansard where Sir John Gilmore, the Fife MP, was representing his constituents and the growers in Scotland. So that's the history. As you can see, back then it was a pretty labour-intensive process. These are two small lorries, and you've got about 7 folk working on them. There were 500 staff in the Cooper factory. So we're interested in seeing if we can bring this industry back to Scotland. What work have we done so far? The first thing we wanted to look at was forming a co-op to grow sugar beet for the chemical industry. I have to say this idea didn't come from the farming side, it came from IBioIC, and there's a couple of members of staff there who were particularly interested and saw it as one of the most easy to produce sources of sugar. And initially the target was producing ethanol to put into fuels, but then followed interest in higher value industrial market and looking at what might be developed at Grangemouth. The why is we're looking for a sustainable bio-based replacement for fossil fuels to produce biochemicals, bioplastics, and biofuels with a significantly lower carbon footprint. A lot of work's been done on this in 6 years, and the main viability study or study we were involved in was a just transition for the chemical sector and a net zero solution for manufacturing. November 2021, and this was led from the chemical side, but we had quite a bit of input in the agriculture side to look at what facilities, equipment, machines would be required and the suitability of land. And that ended up looking at a few different scenarios, the smallest of which was looking at 100 million litres bioethanol plant. It's situated in Grangemouth, and that would then require about 13,500 tons or hectares, sorry, of sugar beet producing 800,000 tons. So that was quite a big ask, we thought at the time. We then did some farmer focus group sessions to get their opinion. These were large arable farmers and potato farmers, the type of people who are used to trying new crops. And the feedback from them was broadly positive. They would be interested in another break crop, definitely. They would be interested in a crop that was profitable, and it has to be profitable. It has to be better than anything else or other crops that they already have in their rotation. So there is interest in growing it. There are two questions where could we provide the hectarage? They also had doubts whether we could provide the hectarage. And secondly, how would they fare if we hit a bad winter, adverse weather? Would it lead to soil compaction issues? So to address these issues, we decided to do the field trials and just observe the crop over the years. And further to the studies, I'm going to show you a couple of maps. And on the map, you can see concentric rings from Grangemouth that go out 30, 40, 50, 60 miles from Grangemouth. And we did some figures. We worked out how much prime arable land there was, and that's in land classes 1, 2, and 3.1. And you can see in eastern Scotland that these land classes, it's quite dispersed. It's not like down in East Anglia where they grow a lot of sugar beet and the land would be all the way around the factory within a 30, 40 mile radius. It is quite dispersed, so that's a bit of a challenge in Scotland. And the table below, we were looking at Grangemouth and we looked at Dundee as well. And we'd need 180 to 194,000 hectares. We have available 180, 190,000 hectares. And if we grew sugar beet in a 1 in 6 rotation, there is about 30,000 hectares available, and 30,000 hectares and 13,000 required for that 100 million litre ethanol plant would be quite difficult to do. So the second thing we looked at on the right-hand side was forming some distributed hubs that could process the product locally, ending up with concentrated sugar syrup, which could then go through road transport to wherever it needed to be processed. And we mapped this on 5 known anaerobic digestion farms with anaerobic digesters who already, some of them already grow sugar beet. And it was just to get a feel for it. And you can see where the centres of sugar beet are up and down the country. So that was the start of it. And now I'll move on to John Hand. John is a specialist in, I've lost your title, sorry, John. You might have to introduce that bit yourself. In biotechnology and chemicals and things like that. So I'll hand over to you, John, to explain why sugar is important for our future manufacturing industry.
Thanks very much, Ian. Thanks for having me on. Just quickly, I can't see the slides, so I hope everything's functioning okay. But I do have a copy here which I can work from. Ian, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah. So hi everyone. I'm John Hand. I'm a specialist in chemical sciences and industrial biotechnology here at Scottish Enterprise, and we're very pleased to sort of, collaborate on this project. Industrial biotechnology has a formal definition, but basically, and you can read about that in the National Plan for Industrial Biotechnology, which I'll show you on screen. But industrial biotechnology is basically how do we take biomass and use biological systems to convert that biomass into something else. So how do we use biological techniques to manufacture products and goods? And Ian's mentioned chemicals, but it can be physical materials as well, structural materials. The opportunity is really endless. We've been really keen to sort of learn by doing. So it's been really important to conduct field trials, really understand the agronomy of the art of the possible when it comes to sugar. And sugar is just one of many feedstocks we'd like to examine in more detail. And why are we doing this? Well, our whole economy is carbon-based. It always has been. We've only really had oil and gas for 100 and something years. Prior to that, our economy was wholly based on bioeconomy. And it's clear if we want to do better in terms of global warming and sustainability, we need to manage carbon differently. And part of the solution is transitioning away from our linear oil and gas fossil-based economy, not in entirety, but to bring in more of a circular bio-based economy and to maximize the value we can extract from a finite viable amount of biogenic carbon, while balancing other needs for food production and biodiversity, etc. And as Ian said, we started this whole process thinking about bioethanol from sugars, and we were thinking about how that gets blended into fuels. But our thinking has matured quite a bit since then. As Ian said, we were at the conference yesterday, the Industrial Biotechnology Innovation Centre's annual conference, and there's a multitude of opportunities and conversion technologies coming through that are being developed. And I hope you can see the first slide. As I said, we started on bioethanol for fuel, which is a commodity. There's a plethora of applications for sugar, converting sugar. On the commodity side, we've also got things like sustainable aviation fuel. And in the top left of that slide, you'll see a slide shot from LanzaTech's website. LanzaTech are an American company. They convert ethanol into kerosene, which is jet fuel. It's called alcohol to jet. So there's already a huge market for sustainable aviation fuel there. Nova Pangea is the top right-hand slide. This is a company who are scaling up down in Teesside. They have a different source of sugar. They are extracting sugars from woody biomass, lignocellulosic waste. And at the minute, they're working with partners to convert it into a range of fuels in the first instance. Similar to Nova Pangea, there's small companies like Sonichem. Their enabling technology is sonification. They use ultrasound to break up cellular material, so they're extracting sugars from all types of biomass. The important point is they're extracting sugars. Sugar is a tremendous starting material for biological systems to convert into a whole range of other viable products that we depend on. To give you an example, in a medical sense, augmentin, one of the world's biggest forms of penicillin, it's derived from glucose. GSK Irvine is a major manufacturer of penicillins. I'm based in Ayrshire. If you go up the road to DSM, Dalry, they make a quarter of the world's vitamin C. The starting point of that process is a sugar. It's a sugar process which they do a chemical synthesis on and convert it into that end product for global use. And in the bottom right-hand corner, if you dive into the scientific literature, there is a huge body of work, new and old, into converting sugars into a whole range of economically viable products that we use in our everyday lives. Iain, could I ask you to jump on to the next slide, please?
Yeah.
And there's a huge opportunity, and it's not just Scottish Enterprise who have switched onto it. We have a national plan for industrial biotechnology. You'll find out on Google. It's hosted by the Industrial Biotechnology Innovation Centre on their website. You can go and look up the specifics there, but bio-based economy, the bioeconomy, and the enabling technologies that support it, things like engineering biology, are getting a lot of attention by the UK government at the minute. They published in recent years a national vision for engineering biology. This is one of the techniques to make biology really smart and to work hard and to make new and different types of products. And we understand from press coverage and dialogue with the UK government that they hope and intend to make significant investment in that enabling technology over the next decade. So this whole discipline of bio-based engineering, converting feedstocks into products, is only getting bigger. It's not going away, so it's something we'll need to be thinking about. And there's new bodies popping up as well to champion it. For example, the Alliance for Sustainable Chemical and Materials was stood up recently. It's got a whole host of players, and they're trying to champion this at a national level to make sure that there's a level playing field for both bio-based and fossil-based products. Iain, if you could move on to my last slide, please. And just building on that, this is a great publication. It just kind of indicates how our national funding bodies like Innovate UK are really getting on board with this theme. This report that I've flagged up, it's a summary report. It's called UK Chem 2050. It's specifically about the chemical industry, but it's a great summary document if you want to go and get a flavour of what's going on in that particular sector. 96% of the products in the economy are chemical based. There's a massive market here. And if you look at that middle part of the slide and the material flow at the bottom, there's a tremendous opportunity to valorize unutilized biomass to decarbonize our economy and the manufacturing sector. There's loads of opportunity. And there's a call to action there on the right, which I won't go through. It's there in the public domain. I'd encourage you to go and read it and immerse yourself in this theme. And lastly, just to point out, our other collaborator in all of this is the Industrial Biotechnology Innovation Centre. They have a free membership structure at the moment. If you want to be engaged in that network, please go along to the website, sign up, become a member, and become immersed in that network and what's going on. They provide a lot of updates, a lot of networking opportunities, and you can really inform yourself about what's coming around the corner. So that's enough from me. I'm rambling on, but I'll pass back to Iain, and just thanks again for the opportunity to speak. Iain.
Thanks, John. Mark, do we have any questions following in the Q&A following John's talk there?
I think they're waiting to get to the end of your talk, Iain.
Okay. John, if I can just ask you, can you give us any examples of, I know you gave us one or two, but any examples elsewhere in the world where sugar is being used in a big way for these new industrial processes?
Yeah, so Iain, I'm thinking back to yesterday when we were at the conference, and there's a Dutch company called Avantium, and they have a substitute for polyethylene. They have a superior polymer, and it's derived from sugars. And they are really looking now to scale up a really gigantic scale. Polymers are a class of materials which I guess in some senses are controversial and essential. We rely on polymers for everything. Our lightweight cars, our high mileage that we get from our vehicles now, it's because they've been lightweighted to things like polymers. But then at the same time, there's poor uses of polymers like single-use plastics, and this is where we need policy to catch up and change that. So it's to make sure that we continue to make products that we want that are bio-based, but at the same time we improve the policy situation so that we don't we use polymers and other bio-derived materials for the best end uses with the least environmental impact. So Avantium stood out as a great example at scale of what's coming through.
And I've had a conversation with you already about the fact there's higher value markets for sugars, speciality and fine chemical markets. Can you just describe what that would be and what that might include?
Yeah, so just to explain those three categories, commodity chemicals is anything which is very large scale and low margin. So that would be your polymers. Specialty chemicals tend to be performance chemicals. So that's like detergents and surfactants. And there's companies out there developing bio-based surfactants from things like fish oils and other oily biomasses. And you don't need a huge quantity of that material for the market. So you're in tens of thousands of tons, and they command a higher premium. And then you've got another category called fine chemicals, which is very wide ranging, but that can be things like perfumes or scents. And I think what we saw yesterday at the conference, that biology is getting to such a stage that bacteria, yeasts, enzymes can be engineered, and they don't end up in the final product, but they can be engineered to create molecules that were inaccessible by biology previously. So if we can unlock more bio-based feedstocks like sugar, what's currently playing out is a revolution in biology which can convert those feedstocks into an increasing range of products more efficiently, more sustainably, and in a really sort of sustainable way. And there's opportunities to connect feedstock suppliers with the technology providers who are creating the end products. And in some cases, and for example, anything that's medical is very highly regulated sort of supply chains. So if we can tie up good sources of biomass into regulated markets, they're not going to change supplier because there's a high barrier to revalidating your supply chain, revalidating the end product because you've changed your standard material, your starting supplier. So there's different types of, I guess, business models and tie-ups that will be available if we enter these non-food markets, more highly regulated end product markets. So it's a rapidly moving area. There's lots of opportunities, but it's, as I said, it's not going away, and it's only getting bigger, and it's only going to become more important as time moves on and the climate crisis worsens. I hope that helps you.
Yes, it does. Thanks. And so you think, is agriculture important in this mix?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, our whole economy is carbon based. Net zero isn't absolute zero when it comes to carbon. You can't escape the carbon cycle, but what we must do is manage our carbon better. And there's no better way to manage carbon than to live within your means. So that doesn't involve using vast amounts of fossil resource, which it's a make, use, dispose economy, and it ends up in the atmosphere. Better to live within your sort of biosphere boundaries, use biomass, biogenic carbon, use as little of it as you can, and wring out maximum value by cascading out the value and being really smart about the technology used to do that. So where does that carbon come from? The land. So agriculture is critically important.
Okay, thanks, John. Have any questions come in, Mark? I think you're muted. You're muted. Is that no?
Yes, there is a question coming around the nicotinoids, but I think we might push that Gordon's way later on, perhaps when we're talking about, after we talked about the trials.
Wait until the end. Right, we'll move on. We'll move on to the farm trials that we had in Eastern Scotland, held last year and this winter. But before we start to describe that, I'd like to ask Gordon, who's been growing, as I say, sugar beet for a number of years for his AD plant, just to describe how he got into it, how he's getting on with it, and what he thinks is the potential for the crop.
Right. Thanks, Iain. Yeah. As you said, we started growing beet a good few years ago, 2016-17, with the view to supplying the feedstock to the AD plant. And why we ended up with beet was quite simple, really. I mean, ideally, these AD plants want a stable feedstock. Further south, you would probably just grow maize and feed your AD plant with a nice stable crop of maize. That's not possible in this part of the world. We can't obviously grow maize. So I had to sort of look what the feedstock would be for this plant, but more than just the feedstock for the plant, taking the bigger picture and thinking on the farms as a whole. We wanted to find a sort of balance and have something with a break crop and not be reliant on just one basically cereal-based feedstock for the AD plant. So it had to fit in with the farming cycle as well as create a feedstock for the AD plant. And ideally be a spring break crop that worked in with our workload on the farm. So when you start looking for these sort of criteria and what can you grow as a spring crop that gives you a high biomass or a high dry matter yield, we started looking at, and there was already people in the area, and we knew from past experience, as you previously pointed out, that there was lots of beet growing in this part of the world up until the 70s. So we knew we could grow the crop. It was just a case of trying to find a way of fitting that into our rotation and getting the equipment and the machinery in this part of the world where there were no contractors that were geared up for this sort of thing. But yeah, a high dry matter, high yielding crop, spring growing crop, fitted in well as a break crop for the farms and give us a good feedstock for the AD plant. And yes, it was a bit of a learning curve. The sort of biggest problems at the start was actually just getting, albeit the cultivation machinery and things we still had here, but things like precision drills and beet harvesters and things, there was nobody in the area had such a thing. So we had to sort of trawl through some machinery dealerships' backyards down south for some fairly old, decrepit second-hand machinery till we got started. But it's a relatively easy crop to grow once you get it established. Weed control in the early days is quite difficult and You need a few applications to get until the beet's up and growing and big enough, strong enough plants to sustain itself through the year. So we have had our ups and downs. It can be a fickle crop to grow. It's very weather reliant, as most crops are, but it's, on the whole, it's been reliable in that we've always managed to get a sort of predicted yield, and it's quite works in well within our farm rotation. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. We'll bring you in as we go through these slides, and there's plenty of pictures to come. So we have two sugar beet varieties that were provided by KWS. They were Harrietta and Katyana, and myself and Gordon got to know these pretty well, as did the others who were harvesting the plots. They are two of the more consistently high-yielding sugar beet varieties with good sugar content. And I had a word with Martin Brown, who may be in this call, the other week, and there isn't really a lot to split the two in terms of performance, and that's roughly what we found. The only observation he had was looking at the two varieties. The top one's Harrietta and the bottom one in the picture is Katyana, and there's a little bit more greening suggesting that the Katyana is a little bit higher out of the ground on this for this particular sample. So these were the two varieties we used. And then I'm using the same map where we mapped all these circular things. Just ignore the circles, and I want to use the map to show the land capability and where the 4 sites are. So our first site, the furthest north, is at Savick Farm at Fovrin Riddell and Andrew Booth's, and it's a silty loam, and that crop was established on the 3rd of June, which is quite a late sowing date, a very late sowing date, in fact, because normally you'd want to get the stuff in April through to mid-May. But sowing was delayed because the soil was cold and the soil was a bit damp at that stage. It was just that particular spring and early summer. We'd say normally that Ellen would be out with the normal sugar beet growing area. It's just got that bit further north and colder temperatures. Stracathro, however, further down, Stracathro estate at Brechin, where Gordon continues to work and was farm manager for a long time. It has a perfect climate, I think, for growing sugar beet. Sandy loam field that the beet went into this year, and it was sown quite early on the 30th of April because the land was relatively free draining. Then moving down, we've got Ross Foster's crop, Ross Foster at Peace Hill Farming Limited, and it was sited at Balmullo, which is fairly close to St Andrews in Fife. And again, a decent, slightly heavier soil that went in the 13th of May. And then right down the bottom, we have the star near Selkirk. We originally intended this crop to be grown in St Boswell's within the arable area, but as you can see, the star is slightly out with. It's actually in a more livestock area. It's a bit of hochland beside a river, 500 feet up. So we thought that would be a good test of the crop to see how it does if there is a severe winter, which we didn't actually get. So that tells you where the crops were established. Next of all, the protocol. We got 0.25 hectare packs of seed, and that meant that people tended, and it was farmer sowing, so the farmers tended to sow them at the end of the field, where they would empty the drill of all the other seed and put in this seed, or the start of the field and put in this seed and then run it out. So we tended to end up in strips or corners of fields and things like that. We wanted it to be 4 rows of planting minimum, so we could harvest the middle 2 rows. We also expected the farmers to use their normal agronomy. They were all fairly used to growing either fodder beet or sugar beet. So we just took their normal agronomy. It had been far too difficult to try and do any trial with similar conditions at these dispersed locations. We had 3 harvesting periods. One was mid-October, the next was mid-December, and the last was early February. And by that, we wanted to track how the crop grew through the winter. Because if we are to grow sugar beet, we want to know what the people whose crops are harvested first, what they might get compared to the people who left in December and the people who left in February. And our expectation was the yield probably would rise from October to December, as it is a crop that can continue to grow in winter time. And we might lose some yield later on due to adverse weather in midwinter through to February. We had 4 replicates for each variety, and that just means we had 4 small plots that we kind of aggregated together to get the average yield for each variety at each location at each harvest. And these were 4 metre by 2 rows. They're 50 centimetre centres, so that's 4 square metres at a time. Effectively, for every variety, with 32 metres linearly, although they weren't all in one line. And what you can see is, in the picture, Gordon we're harvesting the February assessment at SAC, and further back, if you look beyond the orange bags, was the December one, and further back was the October, and this is replicate 4. If you look back the field, you'll see a couple of bags, replicate 3, and then there's another one there and another over the horizon. So that's how we sampled it. We gave kind of a rule of thumb of roughly 35 metres between our plots, but we extended it a little bit here. So we were harvesting in the main either 1 strip or 2 strips. We weren't trying to get an assessment for the field yield. It was just a comparative yield of sequential harvests. So once we'd lifted it, we put it in bags and we hauled it out to the field. Quite a hard job if you've got to carry it in your back. Broke a few people, I think, including myself. And then we took it back to Stedden and washed it, weighed it, and recorded yield for each replicate. We also counted the number of plants in each 4 square metres at the time, because plant population is quite an important thing in sugar beet. And we took a 15 kilo subsample for each variety each time and sent it to BBRO, and they put it to the Tare House near Norwich. So we actually had the same analysis as the people at British Sugar, the farmers who supply British Sugar, had for sugar analysis and a few other things. So then, as pictures of the digging, cleaning and weighing, here's our 4 square metres. We've got the topper knife there. So when we harvested, got to explain, we dug up the root, we loosened it with a grape or a fork, and then we took it and cut the shaws off at the crown area, basically mimicking what the harvester does. We then took it back and we washed it. We had quite an evolution of how you wash sugar beet, because if you try and wash it from above with a power hose, it scatters everywhere. So we started off with metal bars, and then we've eventually moved on to refinements like using a ladder or an aluminium gate. And the main reason for that is it goes into the factory clean, and you have to wash a lot of the soil off. And it does tend to stick to sugar beet because it's quite an ugly plant in some ways, and there's lots of crevices for soil to adhere. And then we weighed it, and for the 3 that were done by SAC Consulting, we used a tripod and spring balance. We were weighing bags of tended to be 20 to 35 kilos each time, and Scottish Agronomy had an electronic balance, electronic scales. So how did they fare? These are the results. So for each set of results on the left-hand side, you can see yield expressed in tonnes per hectare. We multiplied it up to tonnes per hectare for each dig, the average of 4 replicates. So Harrietta, for example, at Savick at Ellen, started off at 45 roughly tonnes per hectare at the end of October, and then up to 54 and up to 55 for Harrietta. And Katyana was a bit lower. Over the piece, you can see that if you look at the Savick, then Harrietta did better. At Stracathro, Katyana did better in the final weigh. At Balmollo, St Andrews, it moved around a little bit, then they were both the same. So the performance has been relatively similar. So I've averaged Harrietta and Katyana to get the average beet tonnes per hectare. So we look at the 2 that are in the main beet and growing area, Stracathro going up to 47, and then 66 in December tonnes per hectare, and then down to 63 later on. And that's not an unexpected pattern, as you would expect to get some gain in the back end, and then maybe some losses later on, not necessarily through frost, but the frosting of leaves on the top being replaced by younger shoots that then come up, younger leaves that then come up. Balmollo bucked the trend. As you can see in the bar chart opposite, we had a yield increase all the way through from 66 to 78 to 87, which was an exceptionally good yield. And all of the root bulbs there were of almost uniform size, I would say. It was a really good looking crop. And I don't know if Ross is on the call just now, but when I told him I was reporting the results, he says, well, that's a heck of a lot better than the rest of my fields. And that's possibly because this is one of the heavier fields he's got at the heavier end of growing sugar beet, and it retained moisture a bit better last season in a dry summer and autumn period. The Bow Hill one, I should mention that we got a bit of fodder beet contamination in that. So it's not a true representation of a sugar beet yield, but it was worth continuing just to observe it and see how it did in that location. So that's the pattern. You can see 3 of them. Your yield is still increasing from October to December. So if we were producing this stuff, and you may have to pay the farmer a little bit more for early harvest than a December harvest or something like that, just to compensate them for the growth, or you just harvest it as you go along on every farm and everyone's the same. So I'll move on to some pictures of the crops. First of all, Balmullo and Fife, the highest yield, 87 tonnes per hectare. It's a very good yield. The average in England, certainly the figures I looked at up to 25 years to 2019 was 75 tonnes per hectare. We wouldn't expect to be at that yield. We're later sowing. We do have longer day length in the middle of the year, but I don't think we can quite reach their levels. And it's a very good yield. The crop always looked good. The first picture on the left was taken in October. I've got a question mark there because unfortunately when the beet was sown, we knew which rows the beet was in, but we weren't given information. We didn't have a note of which was which, Katyana and Harrietta. So I had to do a bit of a guess there. But at the end of the day, we've amalgamated the yield anyway. The middle picture shows the crop in December. You can see the big uniform growing beet or roots. And then in February, it's still got a lot of green cover. It was the best for green cover. So it was pretty well a crop that didn't face too many agronomic or climatic challenges over the year. Moving on to Socathro, I'll hand over to you, Gordon, to describe it because this is your crop.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, bit of a tricky one this year. We were in a lighter sort of field and slightly later drilled than we might have liked to because it was sort of wet, cold spring, and that was followed very quickly by really quite a dry summer. So the crop got off to a really good start, as you see in the first picture there. So good germination, good establishment. But going through sort of May, June, July, we were very low rainfall, and the crop was actually in sort of soil moisture deficit for all of the growing season. So maybe just by bad luck, we thought the trials would be better in the sort of lighter land, but it turned out with the dry season they probably weren't. But as you can see from the sort of figures that early yields weren't looking all that promising, but as the season went on, it sort of compensated, and that was sort of, we could see that throughout the whole farm. In other fields we were growing that we had quite a bit of compensatory growth after a dry summer and quite a good yield increase over the winter months, because it did, a kind winter that kept the green leaf cover over the length of the season. So it, albeit it was a tricky season, but it's quite good to have seen that over the 4 sites at what the different areas and how the seasonal variations are as well. So and it's at the end of the day, we still managed to, we sort of budget on getting 60 tonnes to the hectare as our sort of budget, right? And this crop scraped that at the end of the day as well. So yeah, quite a good disease, a low disease season. Wasn't too much disease pressure. You'll see in some of these pictures a bit of yellowing on the leaves, but that was actually sort of drought stress, and we sort of sent leaves off because we were a bit worried about that, but they came back as being just drought stress. And you can see probably in some of the pictures that were close-up pictures that the leaf was quite curled up because it was trying to conserve moisture under a wee bit of stress. So that was the kind of main story of the season, a cold, wet, late start and a very dry summer, which was a bit of a challenge for the crop all the way through.
Gordon, could I just ask you a couple of questions that have come in? One around how are you managing without neonicotinoids? And have you seen any virus yellows in the crops?
Not this season. We have one season, a couple of seasons ago, we had a bit of virus yellows in there. Yeah, it's focused in everybody's mind who's growing beet that without the neonicotinoids, it makes life very difficult. We're probably lucky that we're not in a beet growing area, so rotation helps, and not having beet in our neighbouring farms. So we're a bit of an island here, so that does help. But there's nothing much you can do with it. Over to the plant breeders to help us there, I suppose. And if we were growing a lot of beet for industry, would we get a derogation to use neonicotinoids again? I really don't know, but they do in other parts of the world. But the short answer is we haven't had any virus yellows problems as such, apart from a small bit 2 or 3 years ago.
Thanks, Gordon.
Okay. I should also add that in the last picture, the middle one is a December picture, the right-hand side one is a February picture. We did come across quite a bit of deer grazing by that stage, so that might have taken a bit away from our test yields. There could have been a kilo or two off, and that is another factor just to bear in mind. But saying that, the yield that we harvest by hand is probably slightly higher than you would get through the harvester. There'll be bits or pieces that will get knocked off through the harvester, I would imagine. Okay, if we move on or up to Savik at Ellen, the late start, late sowing crop, but it did look good pretty well all the way through. There was good leaf cover. So what you're looking at is October, December, and February on the right-hand side. And you can see, the diminishing leaf cover as we go through, but it was still a decent amount of cover. And there were a few frosts before this, but no real serious spell where the frost got into the ground and caused any damage. And the sugar beet plant, as we say, it's good because it is pretty low to the ground, as you can see from the middle picture. And then Bowhill and Selkirk, I've mentioned we've got a bit of fodder beet contamination. It was unfortunate. It must have been when the contractor came in, he cleaned out the drill, but there were still quite a few fodder beet seeds there. They were easy for us to pick out because the sugar beet was white, and we knew the red and yellow ones were rogues, as I call them. It's possible that some of the white ones are rogues as well, but hard to say. And it was a farm that was growing primarily fodder beet. But fodder beet does give you some kind of indication as to how sugar beet would do in an area. And fodder beet tends to be a bit more exposed and out of the soil. And in the last picture on the right-hand side, you can see there's a few tops have kind of died off with the frost, and we did find some rots in what I assume were fodder beet plants as well. But still quite a reasonable yield, and would have been better with an earlier sowing date. So was it a typical season for beet? Gordon's just described it. And I think every time I've written about sugar beet, I've written the words, it has been a difficult season for sugar beet. There's always a challenge. And I think part of that is down to the fact it's at least a 10-month crop for the stuff it's left in the longest. So you're working through a summer, an autumn, and a winter. No two seasons the same, going by the weather records I looked up. But it is, as Gordon says, it's an adaptable crop, and it'll still give you a respectable yield. I know down south, the crop can be badly affected by drought and then come away again and grow without irrigation and things like that. So it is pretty resilient. 2024 was a strange season with the cold, wet spring, the dry summer and autumn, and definitely one of the mildest and driest winters on record. Limited impact of frost or weather. And I asked all the growers, I gave them a chart to fill in of days when they couldn't harvest sugar beet, and the answer really came back, no need to fill in, because this back end up to February, there were very few days when sugar beet could not have been harvested. If you look at the top right, Met Office data from Leuchars, and Leuchars is just along the road from the Balmullo field in Fife, and it's one of the driest parts of Scotland, I should mention that. So you're looking normally 650, 750 millimeters. It was horrendous in 2023 in the back end, and that did cause some problems. Well, we had an open day planned at Stracathro when we said we would be demonstrating the harvester come what may, but the fields were flooded. We were lucky to, or the roads were flooded, lucky to get there. But Gordon, you said you were harvesting a couple of days after that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right, Ian. I mean, the actual beet harvesters are quite, for all their big machines are quite light-footed. They spread the weight quite well over their large tyres and such like. The bigger problem is actually the tractors and trailers to get the beet off. So if the ground's wet and you can keep them in the headlands or keep them on a farm track and unload over the hedges, all the better. But yeah, as you can see, there's quite a range of or a big difference between from year to year. I mean, this year was particularly dry over the growing season, where the previous year wasn't. And you can see our figures from Stracathro there that we only really had half the rainfall over the growing season in 24 that we had in 23. So that made a huge difference.
Do you want to explain the soil moisture deficit chart down there?
Well, yeah, simply it just shows that I took this sort of rainfall for the growing season, April through till October, and the evapotranspiration effect as well, which gives us a sort of deficit for each month all the way through there. So, you know, and come to the end of that season, we were 105, 106 millimeters in deficit because the evapotranspiration was greater than the rainfall. So that's obviously would have had quite an effect on a water-hungry crop like sugar beet.
Okay.
But that said, and we have some figures from on-farm trials of fodder beet that the compensatory growth from October through over the winter months can be up to 15% in that time. So it's still, if it retains a leaf, it will put on a bit of extra yield and growth over the winter months, which, if you plant things well in the varieties that are winter hardy, you could still gain that yield over the winter months.
Good. Okay, and is compaction an issue? We've got this slide here, and now these are pictures from Stracathro. Gordon, do you want to describe the equipment you use and your experience of soil conditions?
Yeah, well, I think obviously you've got to be aware of when you're working and not going when the soil's completely waterlogged, and because it is a root crop and you've got deep cultivations, but because we're not going in with stone separators or making beds and things, that the soil structure is not really changed that much. So you can generally travel quite well with the harvester, and you can see there that was harvesting in early February and quite a nice day, but obviously you can. The harvester's not making much damage there at all, and on that day we were unloading on the headland. And you can help that. We put probably one of the headlands as a grass margin if there's no road or track next to it, so we can unload on the margins. And we're not under, because we're growing and have our own equipment, we're not under huge pressure. It's not like a contractor comes in and you have to lift all your beet in 1 week. We can pick and choose the days we go. So if you're careful, we haven't really found any real compaction or soil structural problems by growing the beet and harvesting all through the winter.
Okay, thanks. I'll just move on to some other results. Top left, we did some trials, or Gordon organised these as well, in 2020 for similar locations, although it was some Boswells in the borders that time. And the yields tons per hectare can be seen there compared to the averages we got in 2024. Aberdeenshire was slightly ahead of this year. Angus and Fife, well, Angus was pretty well the same. Fife was very lower, but still a very good yield. And the borders, I believe they suffered drought that year that affected their crop. But despite that, I think the central borders and the arable area would be a reasonable place to grow sugar beet. On plant count and yield, it was quite interesting to look at our plant counts because the crop that had the highest yield had the lowest plant count, which might be on the low side. What was it, 83,000 plants per hectare? And Gordon, you can maybe explain what kind of plant population you're normally looking at and what you sow.
Yeah, well, we're sort of aiming to get that 100,000 plants per hectare, so we'll sow a bit more than that, 110, 115,000 seeds to get that. But again, it's seasonal dependent. But if there's more space for the root to grow, it will grow, and you'll get bigger roots, smaller numbers, but bigger roots often equals bigger yield. But what we're trying to get is a consistently sized beet all the way across the field, so we keep the plant density quite high. and aiming for that 100,000 plants per hectare.
Okay. And none of them are too out of line. The Ellen might have been a thicker sowing, or it might have just been the late sowing. We ended up with a lot of small plants and some that were about the size of parsnips when we came to go and harvest them.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to explain that the yield, because it was drilled with the same drill, same setting. So it boils down to soil conditions at the time, I think, as well.
All right. Okay, and all important one for sugar beet is the sugar percentages. Looking at these results, you can see Ellen's round about 16.5. Brechin goes from 17, 16.5 down to 16. Balmulla was quite high at over 17. Selkirk was an outlier. I suspect there may have been some fodder beet in there, or maybe it was just the late sowing colder temperatures. But in the main ones that we can be sure were sugar beet, they were all round about what I'm told, they're looking for around about 16.5% sugar, and anything higher is a bonus. So they were all in line and reasonable and what you would expect. So definitely not lower than expectation. I'll just move on to the last slide I've got here. It's a few comments on 6 years of studies and trials. I've said it already, but yields of 60 to 65 tonnes per hectare are achievable in Scotland on a repeated basis. We've got other farms like Gordon's who have been growing beet and reported back, the consistency of the crop. And Angus, Fife, Perth and Kinross, Lothians and Borders would be our preferred growing area. The sugar contents are acceptable. If you grow it in the better prime land, avoid heavy land and areas of high rainfall is a good choice. The arable farmers are keen to grow a profitable break crop if the price is right. The challenge to grow 10 to 15,000 hectares is a big one at a 50 miles radius, and it might be beyond us to replace farmers' crops that are already there. So we're throwing open this idea that is there an opportunity for a smaller scale operation, maybe to feed one of the industries that John mentioned earlier on that's looking for a certain amount of sugar for their processing. And will these higher value markets emerge for the Scottish chemical or industrial manufacturing industry? We hope so. There's a bit of encouragement, I think, from the IBioIC conference. So these are my final comments, just to wrap it up. And we'll take a few questions at this point if there are, Mark.
Yes, we've got a few. Martin chipped in from KWS on the seed front, saying that they're working on a couple of virus yellow tolerant varieties. He mentions that they're commercially available, but they're at a slight yield discount to Harrietta and Katiana. He doubts there will be a return to neonics. His closing comment. One for you, Gordon, around stones and the AD plants. Do you separate stones out before it goes through the AD system, or are stones an issue? I think you said you don't separate them in the field.
We don't separate in the field, but yeah, they are an issue for the AD plant. You just cannot put stones in there, so we have to pre-clean and wash and stone separate before they go into the AD plant. And it's actually the crop's actually chopped before it goes into the AD plant, so there's we're pretty rigorous in taking the stones out. There's just
and then another couple of questions, John, about there's a mention here of silver birch and the fact that there's a potential 2% sugar yield from these trees, and there's over 100,000 hectares in Scotland. Does that ever come across your desk as a potential landscape use?
Yeah, not yet, but I never fail to be amazed at the number of opportunities once you start digging into them. So silver birch is a great example. I'd put up the hyperlink, Mark, into the hemp work that's just been concluded as well, because obviously that was what we graduated onto after sugar beet. There's also opportunities around, existing crops that are grown. So I've put up a link to Cellucomp's website. They have a range of applications for the cellulose that comes from sugar beet. They've actually made that into things like fishing rods, skateboards, They use it as paint thickener. It strengthens concrete. So there's opportunities with new crops we don't grow. There's also opportunities with valorizing the byproducts and the co-products from crops that we currently grow. And I think what we're learning more and more as we increase our, this is getting technical, but as we increase our biorefining capability in Scotland through things like IBioIC, that there are valuable molecules, pharmaceuticals, cosmeceuticals, oils that we can extract from existing leaves and biomasses, and we're just really starting to understand the potential there. But what I would love is that we need to be in listening mode. Where is there an opportunity that the community knows about? James Hutton Institute helped found NAPIC, a National Alternative Proteins Innovation Centre. For argument's sake, is there a crop out there that's maybe rich in protein that isn't properly utilised, because we have a demand for increasing amounts of protein, both for human consumption and actually Scotland's got a big aquaculture industry, and they're working really hard to get away from fish proteins in their aquaculture feeds. They're actively trying to formulate vegetable-based proteins, which are more sustainable. They're not getting fished in the high seas. They're not obtaining the proteins from the high seas. So yeah, we kind of need to be led by the sector, because there's so many applications out there. But yeah, hemp looked like there was good demand, Mark, in the borders. There was a demand case there. I mentioned protein. The silver birch one is new. There'll be more. It's part of the challenge and the opportunity we've got moving forward. What next?
And do any of those, or have any of those touched into the sort of sustainable aviation fuel sectors? I know you were interested at one stage about oilseed rape and potentially that moving across. Does anything further come of that, or indeed sugar beet?
Well, to just give you a bit of context, so sustainable aviation fuel is firmly in the realm of commodity chemicals. So it's high volume, relatively low margin. So you need an awful lot of it. And that's where things like 2G bioethanol it maybe lends itself better. So that's extracting sugars from woody biomass. It could be trees, or it could be other fibrous, woody, lignocellulosic materials. As I say, increasingly we're seeing more technologies created from biology and chemistry to extract more, or to create more from that type of biomass. So that's the sugars. You can make sustainable aviation fuel from sugars. You can also make it from a different method. It's HEFA, it's hydrogenated fatty acids, and that needs oily material, so it needs fats and lipids. So that would be your oilseed rapes, your tallows, perhaps fish oils from fallen stock, stuff that wouldn't be fit for the food chain. But again, it's back to this decision: is there enough around to put into that end use? And I think increasingly what we're coming to understand is there actually higher value products of smaller volume that maybe we should be focusing on first? So what we're always finding with biomass, because it's finite, is there's competition, and it is just part of the landscape at the minute. Who wins, who loses out of biomass competitions, and economically, environmentally, from a sustainability perspective, what's the best thing to do? We're trying to understand that. It's a lot to take in, to be honest. We need as many good people working on it as possible.
Okay, thank you, John. Well, Iain, that's all the questions. So I'll hand back to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I think we've spent a long time talking about the whole thing, the sugar beet, the sugar, the industrial uses, and it's been a very interesting exercise. And although we don't have a current market for it, we've set a marker that there are people who want to grow this crop, and it could be developed if somebody in the audience is listening and wants to develop a new product. So that is no doubt a good thing. Thank you all for attending. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar, and you can read up on this sort of stuff as we work along. Thanks very much.
Thank you.